Okay. All right. We ready to get started?
Yep, let's do it.
We got a jam-packed panel here. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Paula Murphy, our Chief Client Officer here at Halloran Consulting Group. We're really happy that you guys are here to join us for a really important topic. Today's topic is lessons learned from the current state of clinical trials impacted by the war in Ukraine. And I just want to do a brief intro, in terms of the fact that the lessons here that we are learning today are extremely important, really, in terms of how we design and execute conflict resilient trials, and really just kind of resiliency as a whole for our clinical trials, and plan for some of these very much unexpected disasters that can occur. It's a really big topic, and I'm super excited to bring this really esteemed group of panelists together to sort of share their lessons learned. And we're going to get to introductions in just a minute, but just a quick word in terms of our Halloran Town Halls. So for those that maybe are new to the town halls, I do want to introduce ourselves. We are a consulting firm that really spans the areas of development in terms of our areas of focus being regulatory, clinical, quality. We do a lot of strategy and program leadership as well. But really, this allows us to kind of provide, sort of that deep domain expertise. But also, we cover the organizational solutions and technology enablement services too, to advance these functions to the next level of growth. But because of our multidisciplinary kind of focus across the areas of development, we host these town halls really to kind of bring our network together to be talking about sort of these really important issues that we all face here in the industry, and just collectively share the knowledge of not just from our side, but also the network, as you're going to hear from the panelists too today. And so we really want to make sure this is, an opportunity that we can learn from each other. So please ask questions. There is the chat feature here. Please ask questions as we go along. We're going to have time at the end to be able to open it up for questions. We want to see your faces, so please keep your camera on, but also put yourself on mute, I think, while the panelists kind of talk through some of the lessons learned too. So what I'm going to do now is kick it off to Courtney Miller. And Courtney Miller is a senior manager here in our consulting organization here at Halloran, and she's going to be moderating today. So I'll turn it over to her, and then she's going to introduce to our panelists. So take it away, Courtney.
Thanks, Paula. Great introduction. Hi, folks. My name is Courtney Miller. As Paula said, I am the Senior Manager of Consulting Operations here at Halloran, and I will be your moderator today. So I'll be checking the chat intermittently, throw out questions as you have them, and we'll try to get them covered. Joining me today is my colleague, Sean. Sean, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Roach. I am a lead consultant in regulatory CMC with Halloran Consulting Group. Happy to be here and excited to share some perspectives.
Thanks, Sean. And Manny, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Courtney. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And thank you to the Halloran team for organizing these very important forums to share lessons and information and collaboration. I think you guys do it, the best in the industry. So thank you. My name is Manny Lazaro. I'm the Senior Vice President of Clinical Development Operations at Jounce Therapeutics. It's an immuno-oncology company based in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Thanks very much, Manny. Last but not least, Sarji. Sarji, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you so much, Courtney. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for having me here. So I'm Sarji Venstinkiste. I'm Director within the Global Clinical Operations Leadership Team for CSL Behring, and I'm heading the immunology portfolio from a global cleanups perspective for CSL. And I'm looking forward to the conversation that we'll be having today.
Thanks, Sarji. As you can see, we have a great panel today, but we do have a few poll questions to kick off this town hall. We just want to get an understanding of where everyone's experience is and what you're interested in learning today. So Maria, would you go ahead and run the poll, please? We'll give folks about a minute here to respond. Last chance, folks. If you hadn't clicked that submit button, please do so, and let's take a look at the results.
Sharing results now, Courtney.
Thank you, Maria.
Sure.
All right, so interesting split here, guys. It looks like to the first question, does your company have trials impacted by the conflict in Ukraine? About 60% of you said yes. That's more than I expected. So thank you for sharing that information with us. In terms of what you'd like to learn most about today, it looks like we're pretty evenly split. There is one front runner. Risk mitigation and disaster planning, I think, is in front of all of our minds in this particular topic, but a couple of other second-hand subjects: ensuring patient safety, balancing patient safety and data loss, and navigating drug availability all came in at around 30%. So that's interesting as well. And I think we do end up covering all of these items. So again, let me know if you have any questions as we go, but let's go ahead and get started. So first thing that I just want to do is have each of the panelists share their stories. And let's go ahead and start alphabetical first name. Mandy, let's start with you. What trials were you running? Where were they? And what was your initial reaction when you heard about the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, Jounce Therapeutics, as I mentioned, we're an immuno-oncology company. So we embarked on a phase 2 clinical trial in non-small cell lung cancer. Very complicated trial because it was biomarker selected trial. So we had to screen a lot of patients to get to our target sample size. So the trial design was targeting 75 patients and about 80 sites in 14 countries. And we went to Eastern and Central Europe because that's where the patients were who were PD-1 naive, and that was the patient population that we were targeting. And yeah, it was very complicated, and it certainly through the pandemic and then through this event, certainly we learned a lot there. And what was my first reaction? It happened. So leading up to February 24th, I'll never forget that date and where I was when the news hit. We were talking about it. The tensions were rising, and we were reading about it in the news, and we were trying to get some intel from people on the ground there. And in some ways, it was downplayed a little bit, and it was more because I guess there's a lot of political posturing that goes on in Europe, and nobody thought it was really going to happen. So my first reaction was it happened. So we'd already put it in our risk management plan. I'm glad to see that was the leading in a poll, leading the poll. And so we had it, and then now we had to execute to it. So we're going to get into a little more detail on some of the actions that we took later in the conversation.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Manny. Sarji, how about you?
Yes, thank you, Courtney. So CSL Behring is focusing on clinical studies in rare diseases. And we had 3 global trials ongoing. All 3 of them had either both countries, Ukraine or Russia participating. So a bit similar to what Manny was saying. I mean, of course, we had COVID pandemic that was still ongoing, but then suddenly this geopolitical situation occurred. And, initial reaction was, okay, oh my gosh, what will we do now? Another thing to manage. We had some existing framework in place with COVID, but it was really, getting teams together, working around what to do next. in really making sure that we can appropriately manage those global trials that were ongoing, and that not only had those countries, but some other neighboring countries that may have some impact in that situation.
And Sarji, was this something, like Manny had said, that this was something that they had kind of accounted for in their risk mitigation, or was this more unexpected for your team?
It was more unexpected. We were heavily working on COVID mitigations. Teams had, their risk identification plans in place, and you try to mitigate whatever you can mitigate. We didn't expect that it would come to this situation. So there were some preparations and ideas there, but not yet fully worked out. The good thing is that we did have that framework in place with COVID. So we could tap into that pretty fast to get a framework in place for supporting our study teams that had to manage, the boots on the ground, those clinical trials.
Thanks, Sarji. And Sean, you're coming at this from a little bit of a different perspective. You were helping out clients who sort of found themselves in this position. Can you tell us a little bit about the trials or projects that you were working on, and what was your initial reaction?
Sure. So my client is a smaller company, and they're working in infectious disease. They have, as a smaller company, they don't have tremendous reserves of experimental medicines. And then this broke out, and it impacted the supply chain in the neighboring countries, as we all know. They had an ongoing trial in a neighboring country to Ukraine, and suddenly they were in a crunch for clinical trial material. They had some patients who were nearing the end of their treatment, and they didn't have enough dose to treat all of the patients that were coming in. So there were, a lot of questions. As we all know, you define what your drug product is, and that's a regulatory requirement. But if you have an excess in a vial, can you be able to use that to treat more than one patient if it's defined as a single dose? And so there's some regulatory questions around that. And so it was a lot of challenge of, balancing treatment and care versus what the regulatory pathway is, and how quickly can you adapt if you can.
Thank you very much, Sean, for sharing that. And so we've talked a little bit about risk mitigation being sort of first and foremost in people's minds, but when this first happened, what was your biggest concern, each of you? And I'll start with Sarji.
So the biggest concern was really around, safety of staff, safety of the CROs that we work with, and then also what will happen to our patients? What about our site staff, the site capabilities? Will we get drugs and or IMP to those patients that are still under treatment and that they're really in need of that treatment? So it's really around that, safety of employees, staff, partners you work with, and then also the patients that are in our trials. How can we make sure that we support them along the way? They consented to participate in our trial. What can we really do as sponsors to continue that support? Those were the main kind of biggest concerns that we had when the situation occurred.
And Manny, does that resonate for you as well?
Yes, definitely. Before I get into that, I do want to make a comment. Going through this experience, I was so impressed and amazed with the resiliency of the Ukrainian citizens and the staff, and the humanitarian reach out by the surrounding countries. It was just amazing how people were pulling together while the country was under attack. And trying to envision that happening in my neighborhood, it's hard to fathom, but it was just amazing how it all worked out. And kudos to those who were affected by the war. But our first reaction was was similar to Saji as well, to patient safety and site staff, and CRO vendor safety was number one concern. So we, pulled a meeting together that morning on February 24th. Of course, we had people on the ground there with the time difference, and pulled an immediate urgent meeting together just to get an assessment of the impact. So right away did an impact assessment and trying to locate where everybody was. So within 48 hours, we were able to locate all the CRAs and all the staff who were, supporting the clinical trial. And then the next reach out was to the site staff as well too. And I want to say we had 10 patients who were actively receiving treatment in Ukraine on February 24th, and that went uninterrupted, and it was amazing how those patients stayed on, and we were able to locate them, and they were still committed. The patients and the site staff were still committed to continue on, with the treatments.
Thanks, Manny. And Sean, from your perspective, what was the biggest concern?
So since I'm focused on Reg CMC, obviously the primary concern was the patient's safety and, helping to try and maintain the treatment for the patient. I'm kind of one step back into drug supply and trying to see how can we manage getting drugs or manage the resources you have on site to help the, continue treatment for the patients. And that was, as you said, there's limited supply. Do we have some that was lost in Ukraine when the wars broke out? Getting excess out was a question there. Also, how do you best manage what you have on hand?
Thanks, Sean. So I think, it's interesting that we all kind of go to the same place. The first thing that folks have done is go into an impact assessment, get your crisis management teams together. And I'd like to establish a picture of sort of what that looks like, what kind of work goes into something like that. So Manny, Sarji, any comments on that?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, first we want to get an assessment of, and it was very dynamic, as you can imagine, that starting on the 24th and then the days following. So just trying to gather as much information as possible. On the CMC side, we got a letter from our clinical supplier saying, which was located in Kyiv, that operations are shutting down immediately. No drugs coming in, no drugs coming out. So, we had that piece of information. Then, as Sean said, we had to take a quick inventory of the supply that we had to ensure we maintain continuity of drug delivery to the patients who we could locate, and we did a good job of that. But it was that impact assessment, really finding out what's going on, where are the patients, where are the sites, what's our inventory of drug supply, and really concerned about data integrity. For small biopharma, these phase 2 trials are very important, and they're value drivers for a company. So continuing with execution of trial and delivering data is very important for a small biopharma. So that was also a very important component in consideration as well too.
Yeah, similar to what Manny was saying, it's really doing that impact assessment. We could tap into an existing framework that we had in place in the context of COVID. That was a cross-functional matrix team. So the framework was there to do that impact assessment. And we really started in locating, okay, where every site, where are the sites, what's their status? How many patients are still under active treatment? How many patients are in follow-up? What is the situation with our IMP? Do we have sufficient on-site? What about the depots and what's their status? Can they still get IMP out to the sites? What is the expiry date? What is our window that we have in case we need to do some changes to protocol defined windows or anything? So really assessing, well, what is the actual status in each of the sites and with each of the patients in the different studies. That's what we were really looking into. We also had support from Global Trade Compliance because meanwhile there were also sanctions against Russia. So that was also a factor that we really had to consider. So what next? I mean, what about payments? Can we even get supplies like lab kits into the countries? So we did include global trade compliance because they could help us to get some more information and kind of intelligence, I would say, around things that maybe within global diplomacy we were not really fully aware of. So that teamwork was really important, and that cross-departmental input was important in that assessment that we did around the impact.
That's great, Sarji. And I think, Sean and I, we've talked pretty extensively about the impact of those sanctions, because it's something that sort of happened secondarily, but it's crucial. It's heavily impactful. And I don't know, Sean, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, the sanctions were definitely something that was factored in. And also I want to amplify what Sarji and Manny were saying about the interdisciplinary gathering of the client. We had CMC, we had clinical, we had regulatory, and we had legal involved, all assessing the risks. And again, how do you maintain and treat, and do you deviate from your protocol? We literally had days to make a decision, and the question was, how do you manage that?
Yeah.
Looks like we've got a quick question that's, I think, relevant to the conversation in the chat from Daniel Larson. Did anyone have dialogues with regulatory agencies about adjustments that needed to be made with regards to protocol conduct, such as Sean was saying with shared doses?
Yeah, I can answer that. Not specifically, Dan, but I think going back to what Sarji said, we had, we're still in the midst of the pandemic, and we're executing on some of the mitigation as a result of the pandemic as well too. I think this group here knows that documentation is critical. And we knew going into it, even, in our risk mitigation, we're going to be missing visits, we're going to be missing samples. We may lose patients to follow-up. Fortunately, we didn't in our experience, but we couldn't get lab kits in. So therefore, or samples out because of all the travel restrictions that were imposed. So we knew that we couldn't get some of our important biomarker data out or samples out for analysis. So documenting, Dan, everything that happens, I think it's critical. And I think hopefully, in an inspection or even submitting the data for filing, that there's some understanding of why there may have been a deviation to a protocol, or missing data points or missing patients and so forth. And hopefully you can piece it all together and still have a robust package, for the regulators. Because as we all know, during the pandemic, there were a number of revisions to some guidance on how to handle, clinical trials in the midst of a pandemic. So, we were able to leverage a lot of the guidance that were published by both FDA and EMA.
Yes, and maybe to add on to that, what Manny was saying, fully agree with you, Manny, and that's also how we approached it. And we were in a close dialogue with our local colleagues, regulatory ops, to see were there any country-specific guidances that came out. I mean, Ukraine had posted some guidances that could help us as teams to navigate through it. So there we really had some collaboration and really that close connection with the regulatory ops people in country to see, is there anything new that comes out? It's a very evolving situation, not easy to follow, and it's really trying to do the right thing with the little information that you have. So managing that ambiguity was an important factor.
Yeah, and speaking to a colleague who was inspected post-COVID, that's the inspector, essentially just asked and required, this happened, what was your plan and what did you do about it? So if we, going back to the risk mitigation plan, what was our action? And then we do a good job documenting it. So if we can piece it together and tell the story, I think that, will, certainly help, with the integrity of the trial to be inspection ready and so on.
Thanks, everyone. Another really outstanding question in the chat from Tyler Hui here at Halloran. In terms of documentation gaps and limitations around the status of trial participants, Curious to know from panelists how the process of coordinating that on-the-ground knowledge has improved since the onset of the conflict. So from the beginning to now, what are the improvements that you've seen in that process?
Maybe I can get clarification on what on the ground means. I mean, at the site level?
I think he's asking about at the site level, and this is something that at Halloran we've talked about pretty extensively. But so getting information out to participants, getting information out to your CROs and your PIs, what does that look like, and has it improved?
Do you want to start, Sarji? I don't have a response to that because, you know, we're still in the midst of the managing the risks of the conflict and not looking at any metrics on status before, status after. I mean, we certainly had some challenges, right? We had 2 patients transfer out, you know, from sites in eastern part of Ukraine to Moldova. So there was some issues there with documentation, much like what we did in the COVID, in the pandemic. We weren't doing any on-site monitoring, so all the monitoring was done remotely. So I think, Tyler, I think for me, it'd be hard to assess that. I suspect there are going to be gaps there, but we haven't been able to verify that only because we haven't, it's too early and we haven't been on site yet to look at the full, you know, full records.
Yes, and indeed, to add on to that, what we have seen is, you know, delay in data entry on site because of very valid and good reasons. Also, CRA is not able to travel to sites to do that verification. So we are conscious that there may be some gaps in documentation. What we found key and is really that communication and that close contact with sites between, you know, us as a sponsor and the site, to help navigating through that potential gap in documentation. And that has been really key in terms of understanding what is happening on the ground, where do they need help with, what can we do as sponsors, what can they do? And that really has helped tremendously, keeping that communication open very frequently, because sometimes we assumed that, for example, they were not able to get patients in and indeed do data entry. But then, you know, when talking, it turned out, yes, some sites were able to do it. And really having that close communication with the sites to understand, okay, what is your particular situation? And for that particular patient, what do we need to do to try to avoid that gap and be flexible in our CRA visits where it could happen. We let it happen. So it was really that constant communication that was a very critical, you know, factor for success, I would say.
I would say one thing kind of following in on that is I cannot speak to the site level, but you know, just kind of reviewing some of the guidelines that have come out from the EMA and from the respective countries since this has popped up. There's a lot more information out there addressing continuity of the trials and, you know, continuity of the treatment. You know, do you have to relabel your IMP into Ukrainian if the patient transfers to another country or something like that? And, you know, Austria and Belgium, for example, have published some pretty recent guidelines as of April talking about how to manage all of this. And there's been some reference toward ICH E9 regarding how to manage the statistical, you know, when your sample size suddenly gets thrown out the window, how do you manage that statistically and maintain the, you know, integrity of your trial?
Thanks, Sean. One more question from the chat. From Lois Kelly, you mentioned dealing with protocol deviations. Did you find you needed to amend your protocol?
Yeah, we didn't have to. As I mentioned earlier, we had 14 countries in the trial, so it was mainly Russia and Ukraine that were affected. But as I mentioned earlier, we didn't have any missed visits, and we were missing samples, but that's not necessarily catastrophic for the trial. So we're still able to maintain safety through adverse event collection, through the local labs. And also our endpoint is CT. We're in a solid tumor, so looking at changes of the tumor over time. And our sites were still able to upload their CT scans into the portal, to our third-party radiology lab. So we were able to maintain that part of it. So a deviation wasn't necessary. We're just going to have good documentation on. I think it's pretty clear why we're missing certain visits or certain samples because of the conflict, and hopefully it doesn't affect, again, the overall integrity of the trial. But from a safety efficacy perspective, we're okay. So no need to amend the protocol.
Same for us. We also didn't need to amend the protocol. Also, what we learned from COVID, protocols were amended to really allow for some, at-home visits, remote data verification, and so on. So that was already considered in our protocols. So we didn't need to amend the protocol. And of course, there will be protocol deviations in terms of some missed sampling, some missed visit or not of time, but that would be just part of the regular protocol deviation reporting process.
Along that line, I did see that there have been special pathways for expedited review established, so that if you do need to amend your protocol, you can send it in and they specifically call out in the cover letter, this is due to the war in Ukraine. We're making this, they don't want you to try to bundle it. You can't do an annual reportable with a protocol. These need to be standalone. But there are mechanisms in place now where you can do expedited review for changes in protocol if need be.
Thanks, John. So I think, again, coming from a perspective of risk and risk mitigation, we've been dealing with the impact and the after effects of COVID as a whole, as an industry for several years now. And before that, smaller scale things, wildfires in California being a good example. Is this situation unique in any way, Sarji?
I do feel that it's unique in a certain way, and where it's different, in my opinion, from a pandemic or wildfires, is that political sensitivity that you need to account for. We had CRAs that were monitoring in both countries, and suddenly you have that conflict and that personal situation that you're not always aware of, and accounting for that as well in terms of how to communicate, how to suddenly set up internal meetings. Can we still meet with both countries together? There is that sensitivity that to me was an added complexity or an added difference to what we've seen with COVID. I mean, everyone was in it. I mean, we were all impacted. And here you had to deal with two different nations, two different perspectives. And that political sensitivity was, to me, something really different compared to COVID and quite difficult to manage, I would say.
Danny, how about you? How is this situation unique to you?
Well, this is the first time in 30 years I've ever experienced something like this. I mean, certainly this was new for me, but the principle's the same. Although it was unique, I'd say the principles of risk management are the same. So over the years, I think we've gotten really better at risk management, or preparing and putting together risk management. I know for sure this team, everybody on this call, is so good at crisis management and dealing with complex problems. But how can we better avoid those? And by doing so, and this is stated, it's one of the overarching principles of ICT 6 revision 2 about transitioning to more risk management. So that's, by doing that, we need some lessons learned and trying to apply those into our future trials. I think we're doing better at that as an industry. So, like we've been talking about, we're still in the midst of executing to some of the risk mitigation for COVID. So it's just a matter of just triggering something different. What was unique about this situation was mainly about the drug supply, because of the the travel restrictions and trying to get lab supplies into the country, samples out, drug supply into the country, within the country and so forth. So that was definitely disrupted. I don't know, Sean could talk more about this. That was definitely disrupted. And we had to come up with ways to maintain that continuity over time. And some very creative ways. For example, we were able to get drug back into our depot in the Ukraine, but then we had to go through Hungary, for example. And our clinical supplier, came up with, that method, and we had to use some specialty couriers as well too. It became very costly, but again, our goal was to maintain the continuity of drug delivery to the patients. So I would say the principles are the same. So for those who don't have risk management plans, if you're working with CROs, they should have a template. I encourage you, to definitely have one in place so that, and talk about some scenarios, what could happen. And so that you're better prepared when it does happen, because nobody plans for these things. And but nonetheless, the outcome and the success of the trial will be, improved and better, if there's more consideration and time spent on planning, risk planning in the beginning.
Thanks, Manny. It's an excellent suggestion for folks that find themselves in these positions, for sure. Sean, Manny just mentioned the new guidance and protocols managing disruptions. And I know you've done quite a bit of research in this space and thinking in this space. Can you share just a little bit about what's happening in terms of EMA guidances and protocols?
Well, they are talking, there have been many that have come out just recently. I mean, almost every week or month since this broke out. And there's quite a number of new guidances that came out. One of them that I thought was interesting is they have a program called HERA, which is the Health Emergency Management through the EMA. Sorry, I can't remember the exact acronym. But they're talking about how to maintain the continuity of the trials, how to manage gaps in the data, as I was talking about, where they reference the E9. They're building off the lessons learned from COVID, and a lot of countries are publishing their own guidelines to be able to enable the continuity. If you do have to move a client across, again, what labeling does this mean? What does this mean for cost? What does this mean for safety? And so quite a number of good logistical points to consider. There's a very good points to consider article out that came out in late April from the EMA. And it also points back very much parallel to what people have learned in dealing with COVID-19. And, first and foremost, ensure your patient safety, and also plan, if you have risks, these are some of the things that you can consider on how do you manage supplies? How do you manage, communications, documentation, things like that.
Thanks, Sean. So taking everything together, everything that you guys have experienced, everything that your teams have been through in the recent months, what is your biggest takeaway from this situation, and what would you want to leave with the attendees of this event here today? If it's just one thing that you'd like them to leave here with today, how about Manny?
Yeah, as I mentioned, just having a good risk management plan. And, do we spend enough time in the beginning about what could happen? Because we're so focused on, starting a trial, executing the trial, but it really dedicates some time on what's the worst case scenario, what could happen. Just in my experience at Jounce, we had not only the pandemic and the war, we had a flooding event with Hurricane Harvey. We use MD Anderson as one of our sites, and they were in a hurricane. No patients were going in, staff weren't going in. So we'd implemented some procedures as a result of that natural disaster, which we could leverage in, future learnings too. So that would be my takeaway. Like I said, we're good at reacting and responding to crises and issues, but the more we can plan and think about, what to do. And I think you'll be better prepared, in the event it does happen.
It feels like the phrase hope for the best and plan for the worst sort of comes to mind in this scenario.
Yeah, I had a little anecdote. So I had a trial manager that worked for me for once, and he is a very optimistic guy. Things always happened in his career, always happened to plan. And then this one time he ran into this big crisis that affected the timeline, and he wasn't ready for it.
Mm.
So, in my coaching to him, this was several years ago, was, as a good project manager, you should also think about what's the worst case scenario, what could happen, and be ready for that. He wasn't ready. I mean, we got it together, but of course it took more time because there was no consideration for it in the beginning of the trial. So, for those who are managing projects out there, or those who are leading programs and running departments and so forth, it takes a lot of time and energy, but think about what could happen and what are we going to do about it when it does happen. Hopefully it doesn't happen, but like I said, you'll be better prepared if you've planned for it.
How about you, Sarji?
Yes, fully agree with Manny that proactive risk management and identification of potential risks is key. I would also add, in terms of learning, a need for an appetite for smart risk taking. You're in these situations, you need to act fast, they come unexpected. You will need to take some risks, but let's make sure that they're smart and well educated and that they're not impacting, patient safety and data integrity and so on. But it is in such situations, what has helped is that appetite to be able to take those smart risks. Maybe you need for your IMP, move away from the vendor you've always been working with, the months ahead of that situation. And then having that conversation with your legal and quality departments. I mean, do we really need to fully go and reevaluate and qualify another vendor to make sure that our IMP gets to the sites? So really that kind of risk appetite is to me also a key learning in those situations, which can help moving things along, I would say.
Yeah, and I'll also add, we're in an outsourced model, so we use a lot of vendors. But in your qualification and selection of your vendors, ask them what their risk mitigation plan is, because we rely so much on that. Now, using the lab kits as an example, I think many on a call were affected during the pandemic with the lab kit shortage. We were severely affected. It was affecting timelines and study startups and so forth in a big way. So our central lab wasn't ready for the pandemic and what to do with it. And so they are now, but that was a lesson too. So again, just when you select your vendors, make sure you pick somebody who's thinking about that as well too, because you rely so much on them for the success of the trial.
Anything to add?
I would echo and amplify all of the above. The other thing is, this is an interdisciplinary exercise. It's not just clinical, it's not just CMC, it's everybody, and including legal. I mean, one of the perspectives that we balanced in the discussions was, what is the perception? We are all here, with best intentions to protect and preserve the patients and treat them. But will you be perceived as helping the patients, or will you be perceived as maintaining your clinical trial for your bottom line? And that's where a lot of the communication needs to be upfront and clear. And that, this is ethically, we are following the proper ethics. We are following what needs to be done to keep patient safety first.
Yeah, absolutely, Sean. So last question before I open it up to folks who may have questions on the line. Does this change how you think about future trials at all? Manny.
Yes, it definitely does. I think, as we're trying to reach out to new centers, and we know this is standard, qualifying sites based on their experience and infrastructure. Yes, definitely this should be a consideration, Tyler, in terms of what are they going to do if in the event this happens. You hope at the institution level, especially the big academic institutions, have a disaster recovery plan or a business continuity plan. but certainly this should be, a question, I think, in your feasibility in site selection questionnaires.
Sarshi?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Manny. And it's in terms of the future for clinical trials, it's building on what we've seen is happening with COVID, the adaptability of protocols, the flexibility that we want to see, that we want to collaborate with, and those are aspects that I see really should become standards in future of our clinical trials, to be able to with more ease probably manage such situations in the future.
Yeah, we saw for the pandemic, with somewhat related to the question, probably at the site levels, staff shortage was a big issue. I think many of you have experienced that as well too. So that's, another question we can ask. What do you do? What happens if this scenario were to occur? What is your backup plan? Because it certainly was disruptive for us with the staff shortage.
Sean, any last thoughts on whether this changes how we think about clinical trials fundamentally?
I think adaptability and flexibility are the key. And think about what happens in your supply chain. As people have noticed, we experienced everything with COVID, and now again with the disruptions between the sanctions and the war in Ukraine. So what is the right answer? How do you plan? Most of us work with small clients or small companies, and you don't have infinitely deep pockets. So do you figure out what is the fill dose, and is there a mitigation to change your supply chain if need be? Do you have backups and backups to your backups?
Sean, I have a question for you. Does this event and even the pandemic, does that change your thinking on maintaining the the site allocation and par level at all times? So in other words, should you put more there in case there is an interruption in the supply chain, so that you can at least have have continuity for a bit longer? Because I know it's always that fine balance of not giving too much and not having enough to give, especially if clinical supply is an issue.
Absolutely, and that's where you have your backup, and you have to balance it, because often, particularly if you're in a rare disease or something, you don't have a whole lot of your IMP, and so it's just something where you've got to figure it out. And I don't have a good answer for you other than, yes, you have to think about it. Do you add, say you have 10% buffer, do you make that 15% buffer just in case, or something like that? I mean,
Right.
And do you balance that with what is your expiry and what is your storage capability? So
Yeah.
it's a day-to-day struggle.
Awesome. Thanks, guys, for that awesome conversation. I do see a couple of questions in the chat, but I want to check in with folks on the line and see if anybody wants to voice any thoughts or has any questions that they'd like to come off of mute for. Maybe we're a shy group today.
You guys
Could
must have some
Can I
questions.
ask a question?
There's Mark has a question.
Yeah, so I work with a small company, like many of you. We have a handful of employees. We unfortunately also were in Russia and Ukraine. Obviously terribly complicated in terms of trying to figure out next steps. One of the cautionary tales we were told, again, not firsthand knowledge, is that the US FDA is unable to do inspections in either of these countries anymore. And what are the implications for obviously monitoring and data? We don't know the answer. The FDA obviously is kind of, at least as far as we can tell, is in a wait and see attitude of, depends how much data of your set comes out of there. Are they going to put it in a separate bucket? Are they going to discount it in some way? But I'd be interested to know what this group thinks about that. Thank you.
Any regulatory folks on the call? But I think you said it, Mark. I mean, it's just the impact, if we're just going to focus on Ukraine for now, and the data set of the Ukraine. So like I said earlier, we know we're going to have missing data. We know that for sure. We don't think our safety data is compromised, and our efficacy data. But we haven't been able to do on-site monitoring. So again, we don't know what we're going to see once the CRAs get on site there. And I think it's just that, having that conversation with the regulatory agencies on the impact. They may do a sensitivity analysis looking at, okay, if I were to pull out the Ukraine data in this example, what does that do to the overall outcome? Is it different and change? So I think there's a lot of considerations in that. I guess it depends on, again, how much missing data, missing visits, how many protocol deviations, the integrity of that data set from that particular region. I think it's probably a tough one to answer without having that conversation with the regulatory agencies.
Right. And in particular, I'm actually more interested in Russia too, which is they're just not going to step foot in Russia anymore. Right. And I don't know what that looks like moving forward with clinical trials in Russia anymore. It's just, it makes us pause and wonder.
No, it's a risk. I mean, I think it's a risk for all of us to continue to do any new forward-looking trials in Russia. We have the sanctions are still imposed upon us. We signed Jounce, much like those in Massachusetts, Mass Bio. There was a pledge that they were asking companies to sign to not do any business in the future in Russia, and we signed that. So, I mean, Russia is a great source and great place to do clinical trials in some indications. So that certainly it's going to harm our ability to get, drugs out to patients faster by not having that, resource. I don't know if that answered your question, Mark. It was a little ambiguous there. It's hard
I
to
don't
say
think
without...
there is an answer yet.
Yeah,
it's a wait and see. But it was a cautionary tale that I didn't necessarily think about because I'm kind of doing what you do, Manny, of kind of just operations and implementation more. Yeah. But it was, oh yeah, don't forget about, with the US FDA and their ability to step foot in these countries moving forward.
I think if you just follow the basic principle, just keep up with the documentation, really good documentation, at least that will help fill in the gaps for in your data sets there, or even any question in your data sets there. And maybe get your statisticians involved now in doing some scenario planning on worst case. Like, what if we had to exclude all that data, for example, in a worst case situation, or how we're going to handle, missing data. There's lots of techniques, as from a statistical perspective to manage that.
And to add on to that, Manny, indeed, we also had a conversation with our statisticians on those trials to see how, what can we do indeed if we need to take out all of that data. And then proactively, the remaining potential of patients that we could have had in those countries, relying on other countries and sites to randomize the remaining sample size. Those were some other things that we've looked at, but really keeping the communication open with agencies as well as internally statisticians and start thinking about scenarios on what we could do.
I think we have time for maybe one more question from folks on the line, if anybody wants to come off of mute.
Manny, have you considered brokering world peace as a solution?
I'm on, Dan, I'm on that one, right? That's how I spend 90% of my time. If we can solve that one, right, we'll be a better place.
So it does look like we have one other question in the chat, or two other. I think we only have time for one. In terms of budget, what type of items needed to be built in, and was your budget highly affected by these events?
Sarge, you want to go first, or I can go?
I can start. In terms of our budget, we already had foreseen some kind of potential options in terms of home health services wherever that could be possible. Where we did saw a potential impact is when we had to change, couriers in terms of IMP distribution. As the risk was higher, the costs linked to those services became higher. So those were conversations that we had with our third parties in country to see, okay, how would the increase in risk that you're taking in those countries have an impact on the budget. So there were some changes there. Overall, in the globality of a global trial, those were not super significant, but they were there. So those were some of the changes where we saw an increase in budget that we hadn't anticipated because of a higher risk that our third parties had to take. So we had to recontract with some of them.
Yeah, at the site level, no impact on the budgets. We're still, as I mentioned, we didn't do any protocol deviations, protocol amendments to account for the changes. But like Sarji and I mentioned it earlier, I mean, the cost went up because now we had to find specialty couriers to move drug in and out of the Ukraine. And it's a little bit of regulatory increase, but not significant, for regulatory filings, but nothing significant.
We have about 3 minutes left. Any other brave souls on the line who have a question for the group before we close out? All right. Maria, any last minute announcements or?
No, I think we
Close
can
out.
give everybody 2 minutes back of their time. Maybe they can get their lunch ready and head on about their day. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. We will share some key takeaways from the town hall as well as the recording, so you have it to share with your teams. And then please reach out to Halloran for anything that you need, questions, concerns, or any more detailing regarding this great topic that we talked about today.
And thank you very much to our lovely, wonderful panelists for making this conversation so smooth and easy. As a moderator coming in, not knowing what's going to happen, but you guys have been great. So really appreciate it.
Great job, Courtney.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
all.
And everyone.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.